Probably the most right here in our general area is Disappearing Island. Disappearing Island hosts Wilson's plovers and eastern willets that nest on the island. And then down at Canaveral National Seashore, there are a number of Wilson's plovers that nest down there. Least terns, some least terns will nest on some of the islands in the intercoastal, provided there's not much vegetation on them. I went out 3 years ago. There was a little island down in Edgewater. A family whose property backed up onto the river right there gave us permission to keep a kayak there, and we could go out in the kayak and monitor, keep an eye on least tern nests, hopefully to keep things like great blue herons and stuff from coming in and eating the babies off them. But there's not a lot of nesting here in Volusia County the way there is over on the Gulf Coast. Pinellas County, Lee County, Sarasota County, there are islands that are set aside for the purpose of nesting shorebirds. Audubon has, over in Tampa Bay area, has what they call the Coastal Island Sanctuary. Those islands are actually owned by the Florida Inland Navigation District, but there's a find has entered into a partnership with Audubon, Florida, to monitor and maintain those islands in the state that they are. Periodically, they'll hire people to go in, wipe out any vegetation that may be trying to come in that would hinder the birds from nesting. But they have large colonies over there, 400 or 500 pairs of black skimmers, 400 or 500 pairs of least terns. As I mentioned, one of the things I've looked at is using existing soil islands owned by the Florida Inland Navigation District. They are reluctant to lose control of any of their islands. So there are other islands that are maintained by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. There's an arm of them, and I can't remember that group right now. These islands are potential sites that if we go in and remove the vegetation, that the birds could use them. Another option is to actually get or construct some floating barges, cover them with P-rock, little fine rock, and set them in the water out there. Really shallow areas where they're not going to be a hazard to navigation, like somebody can come speeding through in a boat and strike this thing. There are plenty of places where we could anchor just like that. Over at Fort DeSoto, Pinellas County, put out a barge out there, 30 by 15 feet, so not very big, covered with P-rock, and they put up some little least tern decoys to attract least terns. And it took the birds about 3 years to find it for some reason. But now that they have, they nest on it every year. And that's an option that would be easy. For one thing, there's not any soil underneath the rock, so there's nothing for plants to grow on, so we wouldn't have to worry about that. If we can get permission to go in and put those in, I think that's going to be the best solution all around. I'll give you an example. If you're driving along Riverside Drive down in Hartgrove, there are areas just immediately offshore out into the river out there where you see these little mangrove studded islands, and you can see that the water is no more than a foot deep, something like that. Only at low tide you'll see exposed oyster bars and stuff. Those would be perfect areas for these little barges to be anchored. There are areas like that all up and down the Volusia County coast here. So it wouldn't take more than 3 or 4 of those to handle the nesting needs of the birds that come to Volusia County to nest in the first place. And otherwise, they go to other places. I mean, least terns nest as far north as, probably have to get a permit from the U.S. Coast Guard, because this is something that potentially could be a hazard to navigation. And then we probably also would have to have permits from Department of Environmental Protection, the state. I don't think there would be any federal permits involved. If it was close enough, or if the water you wanted to anchor this barge in was deep enough that it could be considered navigable, then you probably would not be able to get a permit to put it in there. It would have to be in something that was really shallow enough that you can bring a kayak through there, but a kayak's not going to be going through at 20 miles an hour and hit something and injure somebody. There aren't many vacant lots. Anything that's there is going to be built on pretty fast. The vacant lots don't stay, quote, vacant very long, because emergent vegetation comes in. And once the vegetation's there, then the birds won't use it. Like the story about Homer and Marge. That's really on my mind because I had written an article about that for our chapter newsletter. The woman who was the editor of the newsletter at the time said, you ought to send this into Birdwatcher's Digest. I bet you they print it. Sure enough, they printed it. I got $75. First paid article I ever had. Had another one. I got a call from Mary Keller about a pair of birds that had nested on a sailboat down in Ponce Inlet. It was in one of the little canals off the river in Ponce Inlet. I went down there and looked. It's a beautiful 44-foot Morgan sailboat. And I was thinking it was going to be mourning doves had nested on the deck or something like that. This boat boom, which is the lower portion of the sail, was aluminum, and it was constructed like this, so it was hollow inside. A pair of great crested flycatchers, which are cavity nesters, had built their nest up in the boom. 3 babies in the nest. I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, well, the first thing what happened was this guy was getting ready to move his boat down to Fort Lauderdale, and he didn't want to take the baby birds in there and leave the parents here. So I thought, what on earth can we do? Up on the shoreline, about 40 feet from where the boat was a huge oak tree with a really nice big limb. So I thought, I'll go to the power company yard, I'll get a piece of PVC, I'll rig a way to hang it into the tree. What I did, I went to the power company yard, got a piece of 6-inch PVC about so long, blocked off one end, drilled a couple of holes and hung some wire in there to be able to attach it to the limb of this oak tree. Went back to the boat, got the owner and his mate to give me a hand, and we swung the boom over to the end of it was hanging over the dock, and I reached in with a wire, and I pulled the nest, baby birds, and everything else out like this, shoved it into that piece of PVC, hung it up in the tree, and within 20 minutes, the parents were flying back and forth feeding the baby birds. The guy got to take his sailboat down to Fort Lauderdale. Happy ending. Another story that I ended up selling to Birdwatcher's Digest. And again, I wrote that up in the Audubon newsletter too. In 2011, Fran Carr, who had been the editor of the newsletter for about 7 or 8 years, decided she didn't want to do it anymore. I ended up taking it over, and I've been the editor of the newsletter ever since. 13 years now.
Wow.
So I write a column called Conservation Note. We have, of course, the chapter president column is always on the front page first. Ray Scory, Ray was a member of the New Haven Bird Club up in Connecticut before he relocated down here, and he affiliated with our chapter as soon as he got here. Fantastic birder, retired commercial photographer. He worked for a company, primarily, his company primarily did brochures for manufacturing companies and things like that. But he also was a great bird photographer. And so once he affiliated with the chapter, doing beginning birding classes, leading field trips. Ray's in his mid to late 80s now, so he's kind of cut back from a lot of that stuff, but he still writes a monthly column for our Audubon newsletter. Leslie Nixon, who is the president of the local Pawpaw chapter of the Native Plant Society, she writes a column about native plants. And then I find, other interesting articles to put into it. Not to put my name in there anywhere other than on my conservation notes column, just because I don't want to make it seem like it's my newsletter. I want to make sure covering all the bases and introducing as many points of view as possible. Ever since I retired from Florida Power and Light in 2009, conservation work with the Audubon chapter has pretty much taken over everything else. We maintain a list of our volunteer hours, and I average somewhere around 60 to 70 hours a month doing something, whether it's teaching birds down at Spruce Creek Park with Louise, or doing these shorebird surveys. The Florida Shorebird Alliance surveys are done from March through August. So I do those on a monthly basis, and when I have birds on rooftops and stuff like that, I'm frequently out there several times a week to monitor what's going on, and if baby birds are falling off the roof, try and get them back up on the roof and things like that. My mother would be so tickled to hear you say that. She was an English teacher, and I really value good writing, and I really try to do it myself. I really paid attention to syntax, punctuation, and all of those kind of things, because I think they were, my mother drilled it into me that those things are important. So.